Breaking news! A second sun god has hit the One Piece world. Her name is Jewelry Bonnie, and her abilities are seemingly limitless. I can honestly say that I never expected to like Bonnie as much as I do now, or Kuma, or Rehead Island as an arc. We pick up with Kuma visiting the Goa Kingdom, and I loved seeing Luffy training, especially with the alligator and the tiger, because it's like a mini Rusakaina, which also featured Luffy making friends with an alligator and a tiger, just much bigger. So Rayleigh took Luffy to this island packed with hundreds of god strength animals, and Luffy would have just been like, yeah, I know the drill. Beat up the animals, eat a couple of them for nourishment, and keep the wimps alive for company. I love seeing this because it reminds me that Luffy's devil fruit was abysmal when he first ate it, and it genuinely took him a decade of work just to get into shape and acquire the skill to use it, because before that it was like trying to slap people with a wet noodle. So what we're seeing is Luffy 1 year before he leaves, perfecting his East Blue moveset, and the attack he's using is the same one that he used to finish Arlong. So there's a fun line where Luffy says, "I'll save this for when I'm up against a strong enemy." Although I will say that Oda is definitely retconning some Luffy abs here. When he first set out to sea, his physique was nowhere near this ripped. Luffy goes on to say, "I've got to be ready for when someone tries to take my crew away," which is sort of what Arlong did with Nami, but not really. And it seems like more of a reference to when Kuma eventually separates the crew. And I'm not quite sure how I feel about this. It's a fun line, but it's a bit too coincidental that he says this while the one person who would eventually take his crew away is watching in secret. I loved the Kuma Dragon interaction though, which is a flashback within a flashback. I always love seeing Oda do stuff like this because his device for flashbacks is to transition into a black page format. But then to have a flashback within the flashback, we transition to this sort of gray because he can't use white, that's modern day, and he can't use black because we're already doing that. So I wonder what would happen if he ever needed to go to a flashback within a flashback within a flashback. But one dragon line that hit me particularly hard was the whole, "Hey, if you continue to talk about this, then you may as well kill me yourself. A child is their parents' weak spot." And obviously no one in this world would know that better than Bartholomew Kuma. And it's a really interesting dichotomy that we have happening here. Dragon is presented as a man who has given up on being a father for the sake of the world, whereas Kuma goes on to give up the world for the sake of being a father to Bonnie, being all prepared to make a deal with the devil and such to produce a series of unstoppable killing machines that could potentially doom the world. So these are two men that decided to walk down completely opposite paths. And I love that neither can really judge the other. Both choices are viewed as perfectly valid by the other, and there's this mutual respect between them. In fact, Dragon is probably the only character in the world who fully understands Kuma, and Kuma is, I guess was, probably the only one who understood Dragon. I have to say though, this is very weird timing, because I very recently did a video ranking the worst fathers in One Piece, and Dragon was obviously there. And after the chapter spoilers came out, it got a barrage of comments saying, well, that didn't age well. But then I read the chapter and I'm like, yeah, no, it aged perfectly fine. Dragon does care for Luffy, and that was quite sweet that we saw that. But he's made the choice to abandon that, in his words, weak spot for the sake of changing the world around him. I'm not saying he's a bad person, definitely not. But even with this chapter, nothing I said in that tier list was wrong. So Kuma has known about Luffy for quite some time, and I think it's quite touching that he was checking in on Luffy in lieu of Dragon. I think this scene also gets tied up very nicely later on in the chapter, because Dragon says, "I'm sure he has his reasons for keeping us in the dark." And you can tell that Dragon 100% knows that Kuma's reasons are Bonnie, because that's what Dragon would do and has done. Keep everyone in the dark about his personal life, because knowing about Luffy would only put Luffy in danger and Dragon in a compromised position. Although it is kind of ironic that one of the people he needed to keep most in the dark was Sabo, but Dragon diagnoses Kuma's condition immediately and prescribes everyone shutting the hell up about it. To the Sorbet Kingdom, and this is where things get a bit wild. Firstly, Alpha is another example of Oda speed running his antagonists, finding the most optimized possible route for me to completely despise her, which was achieved by tearing up all of the letters to Bonnie, and what really rubs it in is seeing the bucket full of previously torn up letters. We see that bucket as we also read the words, "One last thing, Bonnie, you're probably sick of me saying this, but I love you." And no, Bonnie is not sick of hearing it, and you, Kuma, you're not sick of saying it, but Alpha is sick of reading it, and the bucket is probably sick of being filled with it. Here's the thing though, this was part of the deal with Saint Saturn. Kuma agreed that he would be forbidden from contacting Bonnie, and Saturn even said that if he violates that order, Bonnie would be turned into a slave. So Kuma is really playing with fire by sending these letters. Then again, he's also doing a lot of undesirable activities, because we see that he pops in to help the Revolutionary Army every now and then. And at the moment, Kuma is the MVP of the entire army. Whenever he enters the battlefield, even for just a few seconds, it's over. We have yet to see a single person push conscious Kuma to any kind of limit. And there's a genuine discussion to be had about whether or not he may be one of the strongest characters in the series. And all of this without the use of haki, mind you. We still have yet to see a single example of Kuma using any kind of haki. But his devil fruit combined with the Buccaneer body just doesn't seem to need it. Also, his pacifism probably prevents the haki from blooming in battle. So with the letters, I know that Kuma later on says that he wants to write Bonnie a lifetime's worth of love, which is frustratingly beautiful. With this whole flashback, Oda has never missed an opportunity to really push and twist that knife of tragedy in further. But part of me wonders if deep down, or even shallow up, that Kuma knows that Bonnie will never read them. And perhaps this is just a way of expressing his own feelings with a sliver of hope that maybe Bonnie will receive one of them, which is the sort of thing that Kuma has been doing his entire life. Even in the darkest of situations, he's always clung on to a very obscure and faraway hope. I'm also only now just realizing that Kuma using a news coup to deliver letters probably isn't a rare thing to do. In fact, there's probably no other way to get written messages across the world, which means that Big News Morgans doesn't just control the news, he controls a whole new sphere of information as well. Absolutely everything goes through his bird system, although Kuma's letters may not have been in vain at all. Now that Bonnie has seen Kuma's memories, she may have gotten to read or hear or even write each and every one of those letters. So it's less that Kuma was writing them on paper and more that he was marking them in his mind for her to see later. So back to Alpha, I can understand her intercepting the letters, but she tears them up with such disgust and frustration, which is such a great way of making me absolutely hate her. But I have to say that Alpha is also a pretty terrible agent, because apparently she and the other agents completely blew their cover whilst out drinking. And this right here is why Alpha only made it to CP8, because I could never imagine Califa or any of the CP9 agents who were posted on Water 7 slipping up this terribly. But one of my unexpected hits of this chapter, and I guess this flashback in general, is Queen Dowager Connie. She's had a bit of a slow burn over the last 3 chapters, which has been a pretty great life lesson about the elderly. In the first chapter she was introduced, Connie was portrayed as a withered prune with very little agency of her own, constantly being lifted up by people thinking she was Bonnie with no objections. Then in the one after that, Connie opened up and we saw how much of a kind and empathetic figure she was, acting as a stand-in parent for Bonnie. And in this chapter, another layer was pulled back, which shows her to be incredibly clever and cunning. It's Connie who makes the decision to hide Bonnie's powers, and it's also Connie who has her network of information letting them know about Alpha and the disease. And all of that sly cunning is masked by pretending to be a decrepit old woman who may or may not be losing her mind. I love that part at the end where Alpha discovers Connie in Bonnie's clothes, and she's putting on the act pretending to be Bonnie. It's such a good full circle joke, because Connie was introduced with everyone mistaking her for Bonnie. And it also made me think, as a relatively young person, relative to the old people, not relative to the really young people, but we have such a weird perspective on the elderly. We don't have the experience of what it's like to be old. And so we make a lot of assumptions about them based on knowledge that we can't possibly have until we reach that age. It's quite arrogant, really, as displayed by Alpha. So never ever underestimate the elderly, especially in a world like this, because there's a reason that they've lived this long. So seeing Stussy in this chapter was also a big surprise. She's in her Underworld Emperor outfit as well, which gives me nostalgia for Whole Cake Island. Although a thought I've started to have ever since it was revealed that she was a clone is, how did nobody ever suspect anything? I mean, she looks exactly like Buckingham Stussy and even has her name. And look, maybe not everyone had the unfortunate experience of dealing with the Rocks Pirates, but you know who did? Charlotte Lin. She dealt very intimately with them, and she even invited Stussy to Sanji's wedding, and apparently didn't even suspect a thing, despite the fact that Big Mom was on the same crew as the original Stussy. Lin must have known that Stussy was a clone. She just has to have, surely. Although with all of the cloning stuff, some people have suggested that Alpha was a clone of Califa, or that both Alpha and Califa are clones. Again, I think that Alpha was just the thicker older sister, because I just can't see Califa being this bad at her job. But now, one of my favorite parts of the chapter is when Stussy, Vegapunk, and Kuma have a brief yet profound discussion about losing individuality, which I think is brushed by pretty quickly, considering that all 3 people in this room are struggling with just that from 3 completely different perspectives. Kuma is obviously about to lose all sense of agency and become a completely hollow cyborg, whereas Stussy has to reckon with the idea that a lot of her individuality was decided by the original Stussy. And as a clone, is it even possible to be an individual? Are all of her character traits, desires, thoughts, and feelings dictated by Buckingham Stussy? And Vegapunk himself also needs to ask this question, because if he hasn't already, he's about to divide his individuality up into 6 distinct and separate entities. So on some weird level, there isn't a single person in this room who could be described as a true individual, which is something that I've really appreciated about Egghead in general. I don't think that Oda is going to truly dive into these discussions, but he is bringing a lot of uncharacteristically deep ideas to the table here. And it makes me wonder if Oda himself is going through a bit of an existential crisis at the moment, asking himself a lot of questions about the nature of existence and such, because he's a 48-year-old man who's conquered his chosen field and amassed a fortune of over 200 million US dollar dues. And after having reached that point in the hierarchy of needs, he's probably becoming a lot more inquisitive about the more abstract aspects of life. But then we have, as we all expected, Bonnie's escape from the Sorbet Kingdom. And also, we finally have an explanation for Bonnie's ship. The big theory back in the day was that Bonnie was one of Big Mom's relatives due to the pink hair, the lipstick, the uncontrollable gluttony, and the fact that they both had food-focused ships. I never expected the answer to the ship to be this touching though. They made the ship into a pizza because Bonnie is a 9-year-old child and they didn't want her stuck on some stuffy, boring boat. That's what her whole life has already been. So let's make something inviting, something exciting, and something to breathe some much-needed fun into Bonnie's childhood. Also, Bonnie setting out to sea is very reminiscent of Luffy in Chapter 1. It's time to start her adventure, but there's still one antagonist standing in the way, so we need to prove that we're ready to tackle the challenges of this world and knock them out with a single punch. It is fearsome, yet adorable, like a mini Gear 3rd. And this is where Oda's villain speedrunning pays off tremendously. In the space of a chapter and a half, he made me despise Alpha to my core, so it's so unbelievably satisfying to see her get hit. And it's a pretty brutal hit as well. If we're talking about this versus the punch that Luffy gave to the Lord of the Coast, I feel like I'd rather take Luffy's punch. And then just imagine Alpha trying to report this back to the world government. You were outsmarted by a barely functional, like, octogenarian lady, and then you were overpowered by a 9-year-old child. Yeah, there's probably a reason why we haven't seen Alpha in the modern day. But this is, of course, the most insane moment of the chapter, which has unlocked a whole new level of potential for Bonnie, because she's just managed to access a distorted future, which essentially gives her Luffy's Devil Fruit abilities. And if she can do that, what's to stop her mimicking every other power out there? Or even taking on other fruit classes, like a distorted future where she becomes Kaido's Dragon Zoan, or a distorted future where she becomes a Logia. Bonnie's Devil Fruit is the perfect multi-tool. At this stage, the only real limitation is that she's a child, although actually, I don't know if that's a limitation. In Luffy's case, the childlike imagination is a huge benefit for his fruit and key to unlocking it, and I think it's very similar with Bonnie. It takes a very active imagination to conjure these wacky, distorted futures, and this fruit is probably much more dangerous in the possession of a 9-year-old girl than it would be in, say, a sensible 40-year-old accountant named Simon. I also wonder if the fruit gets weaker as you get older, and that perhaps one of the reasons why Bonnie can do so many amazing things is because she's only 9, which means that she has so much unknown potential ahead of her. But once she does age to become more Connie-like, does the fruit become much more limited because, to be blunt, there isn't a whole lot of future left to access? I guess you could age yourself back down, but then could you use distorted future in conjunction with age restoration? I do not know. And in theory, could Bonnie also use distorted future on others and turn anyone she wants into Nika? If so, we could end up with an entire army of rubber people. But this chapter showcases one of the greatest strengths of the series, which is that every character feels like the protagonist of their own story. Throughout this whole flashback, Kuma has been compelling enough that I would be more than happy to follow a whole story just about him. Meanwhile, I also think that Bonnie could definitely carry her own story as well. In fact, were it not for the existence of Luffy, there would be a great argument to make that Bonnie will become the joy boy we're looking for. She has everything, the inherited will and the power to do so, and really the only thing stopping her is that this is Luffy's story. And then there's the potential question that we need to raise every arc. Will Bonnie become a Straw Hat? Could she take up the apprentice role on the ship, like Shanks and Buggy did for the Roger Pirates? A random child that the crew stumbled upon and incidentally found themselves raising. Because right now, the apprentice role is the only standard one missing from the Straw Hats. That influence on the next generation, even if Bonnie is considered part of this generation. But surely at some point, if she hasn't already, Bonnie will realize that Luffy is Nika. And what more could she possibly want to do than make her father's dream come true? So you let me know in the comments, what do you think of Jewelry Bonnie's chances of joining the crew?